Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Nina Levchuk.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session. As I mentioned, my name is Nina Levchuk. I'm a co-founder of Impact Force, and as well, I'm a social activist, tech leader, cybersecurity and innovation advisor to United Nations Women, and very, very proud a member of Women Leadership Council of GLOBSEC. Malicious cyber activity and state-sponsored intrusions continue to challenge European security, with recent high-profile incidents revealing the scope and sophistication of foreign cyber operations. This campaign often targets critical government institutions and, of course, private sector actors, aiming to steal sensitive information and gain strategic advantage in the global competition for technological leadership. As Europe, we right now navigate this very complex landscape. Questions emerge about the balance between transatlantic cybersecurity partnership and continent's inspiration of greater digital independency or autonomy. Understanding the motivation, capabilities, and long-term objective of key global actors, including but not limited to China and Russia, while examining the evolving role of allied cooperation is essential. And today we're going to talk very interesting question. I hope we're going to bring a lot of elephants in the room. There is no bad questions, by the way. So if you don't feel comfortable about some of the parts of this topic, like cybersecurity, feel free still to ask any questions that popping up to your mind. So I will urge you to do this. And without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage our distinguished and wonderful speaker. First, I would like to invite to the stage Michael Chertoff, co-founder and executive chairman of Chertoff Group. Michael, please. Next, Joanna Bryson, professor of ethics and technology, Hertie School. Helmut Reisinger, CEO for EMEA and LATAM Palo Alto networks. Ringrose, Head of Division for Connectivity and Digital Transition, European External Action Service. Welcome, everyone, first of all. Secondly, I wanted to remind you that we have an incredible tool that's called Slido. There should be somewhere a QR code. I know that you already know how to use it, so please scan it. Make sure you ask a question. I will try, as I said, to integrate your question during the panel discussion and in the end. The hashtag is GLOBSEC Forums, so it should be, okay, it's already there. So to kick off our wonderful dialogue, and I really hope that it would be interesting dialogue, I wanted to start with a very, very short statement. Yesterday, President of Czechia, Petr Pavel, he emphasized the need to better understand our sources of threat and impacted sectors. During numerous discussions that I heard yesterday on defense and cyber, it was widely acknowledged that cybersecurity landscape is global. I heard you, Michael, was saying a couple of times this yesterday. Yet, lack of aligned international regulatory frameworks make global consensus on cybersecurity, and not only on cybersecurity, as we know, for example, from COP30, right? Is kind of challenging. Furthermore, the Digital Service Act is reportedly facing pressure from the current US administration to loosen its provision. So, Joanna, I would like to start actually with you. Considering this point that I just mentioned, is the current US administration's approach moving the United States closer to, or maybe even into, the same basket as China and Russia in the way we need to protect Europe from cyber actors? What do you think?
It's such an interesting question. I think it's not exactly the same basket. Let's put it this way. One of the things that when we hear this narrative about, it's true, the internet is global, but also like outer space is like extra global, right? And nevertheless, we have about 5 different GPS systems for resilience. And resilience includes our ability to not entirely be throttled by a single actor, that we need to keep cooperation. So I think cooperation is very important. the current U.S. administration is echoing a line that we also heard quite often from the previous administration. There was a lot of pressure on an awful lot of areas, and so my expertise is more AI than cybersecurity, although I have attended some cybersecurity meetings too. But there was a lot of pressure to try to have a single platform because that makes it easier for big tech. And of course, they want it to be as inexpensive to be regulated as it is in the United States. However, actually, looking at what's happening in the United States right now, it's not clear to me that that is actually long-term less expensive. So a good regulatory context can actually make it easier to do business in a stable way. So I wouldn't say that it's exactly the same basket, but you hear me not completely denying it, I guess.
Okay, thank you, David. What is your take on that?
I think, I mean, of course, the US is not moving closer to China and Russia at all. I think you only have to look at what happened a few weeks ago when there was a cyber attack, or they discovered a cyber attack that had been going on for a long time in the Czech Foreign Ministry here. The US government had been flagging cyber attacks on this country by entities associated to the Russian GRU for a long time. Mm-hmm. When the cyber attack was uncovered on the Czech Foreign Ministry, NATO and the European Union issued supportive statements of the Czech government attributing this attack to an actor associated to a Chinese entity as well. I think this shows that there is cooperation, there is alignment on this. This is something that really matters to us, and we've had this for a long time. Ever since the EU developed what we call our cyber diplomacy toolbox, we've been able to use all of our foreign policy tools to support our aims in the cyber area. A lot of these tools were developed in a more analog era, but now when we can attribute an attack to an advanced persistent threat actor, like the Volt Typhoon and all of these attacks and so on, we can apply sanctions, we can apply bans, we can apply all the tools that we have available, and frequently those are exactly the same responses that come from our US partners. So I think in the cyber area, we are working together. In other areas, like promoting trusted vendors in connectivity, for example. I was at a conference in Stockholm earlier this week, and we had very good conversations with our US colleagues about how to continue promoting trusted vendors in 5G, in submarine cables, and so on, around the world with our partners in Costa Rica, in Panama, in the Philippines, and so on. And I think we share the same objectives, and we understand the threat the same way. So I think it would be wrong to draw a parallel like that. There's a lot of other issues in multilateral fora where it's a little bit more complex, of course. But I think on the cyber issues, which are really important, then, you know, we're working.
Okay, we will go back actually to the, I would say, the US administration pressure and as well the processes would be interesting to deep dive. But Michael, what do you think? Are we still allies? In which basket we should put you?
No, I mean, I think that, you know, what we have in common and as a joint interest is much greater than the differences. Where I've seen some differences between the European path and the US path has been in regulation of content, hate speech, disinformation, where I think Europe has been a little bit more aggressive in making the platform's own responsibility for whether the content that they're purveying is hate speech or false. In the U.S., there's a kind of a political interest in being, you know, using the First Amendment or free speech to protect a lot of things that might be considered disinformation. But in terms of core cybersecurity, efforts to steal data or interfere with operating systems or critical infrastructure, there I think there's a common approach. And I think there needs to be a common approach because we could get into a situation now that I think cyber attacks are part of global conflict. We could have a situation where we have to invoke Article 5 with a certain kind of attack. And so I think having a common picture and a common approach, I think on both sides of the Atlantic would be viewed as important.
And saying that, what do you think the Taxio, with whom we obviously need to work closely, right? Are they actually aligned with Trump administration right now? And are they aligned to Europe to align on this global cybersecurity framework that we need to work on together?
You know, I mean, I don't want to speak for the whole tech community, but my general impression is the area where, again, there is most likely to be some discomfort with the European approach is on the issue of putting content regulation as a responsibility of the platforms. But when it comes to actual protection of the infrastructure, there I think there is a lot of alignment. I think the administration and the prior administration believed it was important to have protections in place and doctrine in place and resilience and also standards so that the tech community could raise its competence level with respect to cybersecurity. And I don't see any difference as far as Europe is concerned with the same approach.
Okay, thank you. Then I would like to ask you, all of you, give me all the three things that we need to start already now to align on processes to unite our frameworks. You're all saying that we need it, but two concrete things, very shortly, please.
Can I go back to the previous question? Because
yes, absolutely.
The president was actually right what he said yesterday, which means you need to understand where your captures are and the sensors, basically, what are the sources of this. And there, honestly, I think we are over-talking the story divide between US and between Europe because we are facing the same challenges and the same threat landscape. The attackers do not know or don't want to distinguish between borders. And unfortunately, to the credit of both Europe as well as the United States, we have very attractive assets that are the target. And therefore, the increase is extremely strong in terms of this threat landscape. The issue is that we are facing similar challenges, which means historically, cybersecurity, what I call today is a team play, and it's a data issue first and foremost, is a very fragmented industry. On average, a large organization, whether it's public sector, whether it's private, they use about 30 to 50 different tools to protect the digital essentials. The issue is these tools don't speak to each other. It needs a lot of resources in a scarce world of tech talent. And on the other hand, if you look to the attacker side, AI is driving speed, scale, and sophistication. I'll give you one concrete data point. 3 years ago, on average, the time between compromise of an organization, whether public or private, to exfiltration of data, 3 years ago, it took 9 days on average. Now we are down to 1 day on average. This is because the attacker side is leveraging machine learning as well in order to automatically create an avalanche on it. And that's why we are convinced cybersecurity is not only a team sport, but it's a data issue. You need to have good telemetry data. The sources can be from networks, it can be from cloud assets, it can be from a production machine, it can be in the defense industry, it can come from a tank that communicates maybe with HQ. And therefore, you need to have a lot of telemetry to provide good cybersecurity. You need then to analyze the data. You run your machine learning. We have been doing this for more than 10 years, not because now that there's ChatGPT, because there's so much automation you need to do to cope with those threats. And then you come to good cybersecurity outcomes. And in addition, you offer a path to simplification. But the challenges, honestly, are the same in the US as well as in Europe.
I would like later to talk with you about the gaps as well, but yes.
But I want to slightly defend its counter answer, although I agree largely with everything everybody said. But let me give two specific ways that Europe is in a different situation than the US. The US is interested in defending the interests of its major revenue producers, who are the ones who have the liabilities if something goes wrong with cybersecurity. So that's one thing that we've been dealing with for a very long time. And the other thing that's brand new is the allegations of having the strategic strength of the digital being used to shut off availability of weapon systems actually in Russia, but over the Ukrainian occupied parts of Russia. So if somebody has a kill switch, and we saw this also with the ICC, if someone has a kill switch and they can just shut off email access, and that is part of our externalized mind, then that is a different kind of threat than we face from the other parts of the world.
And Joanna, can you continue? In case of worst scenario that you already touched upon will happen, what safeguards should be prioritized?
Well, the cutting off part, all we can do, and I think Europe is now scrambling to do this just as it is with weapon systems, is to try to have alternatives. There is nothing else you can do. But and this
Alternatives
is why,
in Europe, you mean?
yeah, well, it doesn't have to be, as long, but it has to be some kind of if there's, like I said, there's only 5. There's like 190 countries in the UN or something, and but there's only five forms of GPS, right? So at least if you have alternative sourcing, then you have some kind of different people you could be cooperating with if you had to.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back just for the 3 things, and it should be very short 3 things. So if you believe that we actually could align, yes or no, you could say just shortly, to unite our frameworks, what should be practical steps? 2, 3, whatever is first coming to your mind, but very, very short one, please. Who wants to? David, please.
Maybe. I think there's really useful conversations around the DSA on the aspect of protecting children online. This is an area where it seems to me there's bipartisan support in the US for doing something to keep children safe online, and that's one of the objectives of the Digital Services Act as well. So I think in terms of regulating content, people, it's not just one issue, but when you look at specific part, I think there's a lot of common things that we could do. Second thing, I think recognizing the importance of disinformation in electoral situations. And here, for example, we know Moldova is having elections in September. And just the other week, the Commission and the Moldovan government had a stress testing exercise, a simulation, to look at the role of platforms during the upcoming election. And Google, Meta, and TikTok were all there. They all joined in. They all volunteered. They all came along. And they took part in this exercise because they realized that this is an issue, right? Because we see what happened in other recent elections in Europe. And, this is something that really matters. And we know the pressure and the money that's going to come from Russia in these elections. And this is an area where US platforms said, yeah, we'll come along, we'll join in. And so we got a lot of NGOs with transparency and so on. And then the third area, I think, multilateral area. And I think, there is no global framework, but we're trying to do global frameworks at the multilateral level, and 2 important things. One is an open-ended working group on cyber, and there it's very clear Russia and China are putting a lot of resources into this to achieve the opposite of what we want. So I think it's not that we think multilateral is the place that's going to solve everything, but when we look at the resources Russia is putting into fighting against us, we must realize that it actually matters. So I think we need to be aligned. And the other one is the World Summit on Information Society, which is about internet governance, where again, Russia, China, and others are trying to move the internet towards a space governed by governments rather than by the multi-stakeholder framework that we've got right now with ICANN based in California and so on. And we need to defend that. And I think these are areas where there's a lot of scope for cooperation with the US.
Do you like to add to those points? Not to repeat, but maybe a couple more to add.
If I could add, so I think coming back to what I said before, that cyber is a team sport. Good private-public partnerships are critical. So, for example, we are a founding member as Palo Alto Networks of the Threat Intelligence Alliance. We share threat data that is hot and that is important and critical. We are not a law enforcement agency, so that's why we need to work together with when we detect something and that's critical and it's impacting a lot of enterprises or even nation states, then we need to do that. Second recommendation I would have is simply creating the awareness that the more we go digital, at whichever level, private level, enterprise level, nation state level, or administration, the more it means exposure. And for this, you need to have the appropriate approach, take a positive stance to when it comes to regulation, when I talk about NIS2, policymakers need still to transpond that into local legislation. But overall, it helps to increase the resilience. Because I think we need to learn, and we all have learned this since the start of the Ukrainian war here in Europe, think the unthinkable. And there, nation states can prepare well, like we do, for example, it's quite interesting. We see the readiness to go into big programs on cybersecurity on nation state side is the bigger, the closer you get to the Ukrainian border in Europe. That's why the awareness level is there, and you can have those solutions where you detect immediately on the threat landscape if something happened, you make an outside-in view. It's called attack surface analysis. that is done. It gives you a complete picture of what do the hackers see from outside looking at your assets.
And that's incredible. And you're a technical expert in this, clearly. So with how many policymakers in the last year you sit down at the same table and explain this very complex landscape?
Well, I'm usually quite a lot on the front line, which means with customers, and public sector is a key topic for us because it touches as well the national interest of either multilateral organizations like or supranational organizations like the EU, or it touches defense organizations like NATO, or it touches nation states.
So with many?
With many is the short answer.
Okay.
Take one example, hospitals. It's a super unfortunate inroad to the hackers because it's so fragmented of outdated technical equipment. And therefore, you have seen the case in France of Versailles Hospital, and you only feel it when there is this tragedy that people cannot be treated because suddenly the systems are not available.
Joanna, I thought you wanted to just, let's first, Joanna added to the practical things as well that we could take now.
No, it was a comment on the, it's a complicated thing again. When we say protecting children online, I mean, there's nothing more obvious than everybody wants to protect children. But on the other hand, there's a huge division within countries about whether that's best done by breaking cybersecurity or by defending cybersecurity. So in fact, most children need a means by which to report their abusers, who are unfortunately often in their own households, right? So cybersecurity for children is extremely important, and yet a lot of the people who pretend to be caring about children have a vested interest in breaking cybersecurity. So I'm not saying that security is ever an easy thing, but I'm just saying that even some of these things are more complicated than are being presented.
Solutions. What can we do?
Well, let me just say, I think in general, first of all, one thing government can do is give guidance and create incentives for the private sector. I think when I deal with people in the private sector, often they throw their hands up because everything seems so complicated that they feel that they can't win. And we need to be able to explain to people that there's no guarantee that you're never going to get hacked, but what you need to do is build layers of defense and also resilience. And then you need to give the private sector standards they can look to and incentives so they implement that. Because if they feel they're spending all their money defending themselves, they're not going to want to do it. So the ability to analyze what the threat vectors are, to come up with a set of general standards that are not going to be perfect, but are going to reduce and manage the risk, and then to build in ability to help firms become resilient, I think is a practical way to engage the private sector in making sure they're taking reasonable steps to protect themselves.
I do actually have a solution that I've been promoting, and I'm just hesitant to promote it in this context, in the security context, because I haven't thought it all the way through, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. I do think we really need to think about how transnationally to regulate utilities that are transnational. So historically, the United States established antitrust to make sure that single actors didn't get too powerful for democracy to be able to govern. And they were very successful in this, and they, in fact, enforced, after World War II, both Germany and Japan had to take on US-style antitrust legislation. Well, often people think of that as only breaking up, things. But in fact, part of antitrust is that you identify things that do have natural scaling properties, and you regulate them extra. You don't let them go free rein and do whatever they think. You actually take more governance because you have to compensate for the fact that the market is not going to provide governance, right? So the problem is that the U.S. stopped enforcing this. They stopped recognizing new utilities somewhere around 1980. Like, water, electricity, things like that. But what about search? What about operating systems? What about ad tech? What about political communication, like Twitter, right? So we have these interesting new things that might be, and they have absolutely international impacts. And it may be that the reason they stopped regulating was just because the Soviet economy plateaued and they thought, we don't need to worry about this anymore. But I'm worried that it was because it's actually beyond the scope of any one country. And we do need to figure out a series of treaties to help us figure out what is a just, fair, workable solution so that all these countries are being affected by these companies have some kind of say in how they are governed. What are the trade-offs for having so much power, and how is that going to be controlled by legitimate governments?
So more regulation, as far as I understand, to those direct. David, are you agree? I mean, you are an expert. You're from the policy side as well. What is your take on that? Are the policy people who are working on regulation in Europe specifically, first of all, do they understand complexity? I mean, I know you are, but like your colleagues. And are you agree with expanding regulation to even other areas that Joanna has mentioned?
I think we've spent a lot of time on regulation, and I agree with Helmut that companies don't necessarily dislike regulation, but they want predictability. They like regulation when it's predictable, when they can define the market and they can operate in it and so on. What we're trying to do now with our regulation is, we're looking at the compliance burdens, and we realize that in some of these, for example, if you're a big platform, compliance is fine. It's a small percentage of a very large company and so on, but for SMEs, maybe there's some burdens there that we can get rid of, reporting obligations and things like that. So that's how we're looking at a lot of the regulatory issues right now, not just in the digital space, but in the climate-related, we're still trying to see how we can get to our net zero obligations, but we realize that we can't do that at the cost of SMEs and so on. So I don't think you're going to see extra regulation in the digital sphere in the next few years. What we do need to do, I think in the cyber area, also we need to focus on helping people implement these rules, and those people is either the individual member states, so bodies like ENISA, the EU body that helps all the member states, has received some more resources to work with all the member states to make sure that we've got 27 good, solid enforcement capacities around the EU and not a big difference between the good ones and the other ones, for example. Also support to companies to see how we can work on that. I think the space that we need to do a bit more work on is probably around certification and so on, because certifying good cybersecurity products is an important, it's a bit fragmented at the moment as well. So I think a lot of the regulation is in there. If you look at how much new regulation we brought in the last mandate, I think we were ahead of the curve, and now basically we need to concentrate on implementing it, make sure it works, make sure we can call out the bad actors, make sure we got the capacity, because we don't have infinite capacity. There's not an infinite number of cybersecurity experts out there either. Huh? But if you look at things like the Digital Services Act, for example, we've got 130 people in the European Commission now responsible for enforcing this. We were very worried at the beginning that we'd find it very difficult to get good people, but we've got a lot of really good people who've come in a situation maybe a bit closer to the US, where they come in, they figure out, okay, I'll work in enforcement for a few years. I've got a PhD, I've got a bit of experience. I'll work in enforcement for a few years, and then maybe I'll go off again like that. So we've got a model there, I think that's
it gives a hope, let's call it this way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Helmut, before, by the way, I open as well to Slider, we have two questions here as well. You could raise your hand, so please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I will just before we move to the audience question, Helmut, I want to talk with you a bit more on private-public sector collaboration. From my observation, from my practice, when private security actors operate in multiple jurisdictions or in conflict zones, you have mentioned today, for example, Ukraine, we have Israel, etc., determining who is responsible to their actions and how to hold them accountable is extremely challenging, right? And many existing frameworks focusing only on national oversight, which is a bit insufficient when it's coming to the global operation. This one of the gaps. What are the gaps in your practice in public-private sector collaboration and the accountability when you're working with those partners? Where do you see them, and how the private sector could help to fill them in an efficient way?
Well, first of all, we are active across the globe. We need to stand by the local needs and stipulations that are there. In Germany, you need to have C5 certification if you want to protect, let's call them national essentials. You need to do it. That's a common business practice. If I was a French enterprise, if I was an American one, if I was a Brazilian enterprise who does business, that's naturally what you have to do. And my call before was not to say we need more regulation. I was just saying we need to take the positive stance of it. And regulation only provides us with a framework. It does not give us automatically, oh, this is what exactly you have to do. It still forces the enterprise, the nation state, a public organization, a hospital, to do the needed thing. And what is needed there, a big gap, is rethinking cybersecurity end to end, and not only another point solution so that you have, besides your 62 existing one, number 63, to think that now you're better protected. That's definitely the wrong approach. Because as I said, cyber is a data issue in the end. And therefore, you need to have it holistically, because the entry vectors can be multifold. And therefore, you also need then to consolidate this data and therefore run your resolution cybersecurity models on top of it.
There are two dimensions, I think, that have recently emerged as being more salient in the area of cyber risk, that involve the fact that nation states now view cyber as a domain of conflict. And we are seeing wars now in various parts of the globe, and those wars are not only on the ground or at sea, but they're in cyberspace. And government can play a special role with respect to two dimensions that are raised by this now weaponization of cyber attacks. One is building resilience, working with the private sector to build resilience. A great example is Ukraine. When the Russians invaded a couple of years ago, they did launch cyber attacks. The Ukrainians had previously moved their critical data into the cloud outside of their own boundaries. So while the network was attacked, they were able to still operate because they had their data outside. Helping the private sector build that kind of resilience is important. The other issue, which we haven't talked about and is maybe the most complicated, is deterrence. What is the role of the government? I don't think it's for the private sector to deter by threatening response. And that gets into what is sometimes called active defense, but is really offense. And there have been a couple of occasions where there have been government-launched cyber attacks, either directly or through surrogates, where incapacitating the servers that were used to launch the attacks has been an appropriate response. But we haven't yet fleshed a doctrine of deterrence in cyberspace out the way we did, for example, with the nuclear weapon over decades. And I think we need to start to think about it, because in my view, we're going to just see an intensification of cyber attacks as part of global conflict rather than a diminution.
I couldn't agree more with you. I would like to give opportunity to the gentleman here, and then Matre, and then the third, and then one question that I would like to integrate from Slido. Yes.
Thanks very much.
Your name and question shortly.
Thanks very much. James Cantor from the Media EU Scream. A question for the panel, but also in particular for the European External Action Service. Given the huge threat to democracy from foreign interference and manipulation, Romania, Moldova, etc., is leaving content regulation as a responsibility of the platforms really sufficient? Is that really going to work? And is that just per the wishes of Silicon Valley surrogates like Vice President J.D. Vance? And is that a kind of admission that the apparent stance of the European Commission in not enforcing the Digital Services Act in the case of Meta and X going to just be something that we have to accept? And after all, I think it's a little bit rewriting history to say that the DSA is, primarily focused on children. It was really meant to be precisely for the things that the DSA is supposed to be doing. So that's really my question, content moderation. Thank you.
Who would like to take it?
Yeah, I don't think I said it's primarily for protecting children. I think that's it. I said it's and it's a good conversation that we can have. I think there's a whole bunch of legal cases out there at the moment on the platforms, and I think Article 230 in the US. No one's talking about getting rid of Article 230. We're not talking about that in the EU either. We don't want to. I used to work with Vice President Ansip. And his line as an Estonian was, I know what a Ministry of Truth looks like, and we're not about to create a new one at the level of the EU. But we do need to insist that platforms recognize their responsibility. I think there's an important change. There used to be big difference between sort of the laws that we were looking at and the experience people had and so on. And if you talked about content moderation to people a couple of years ago, nobody would have understood what you were talking about. But I think a lot of people in the world have seen what happens when the people responsible for content moderation, the amount of people responsible for content moderation are slashed by, I don't know, 70% or something like this. They see what happens in their feeds, they see what happened on their social media and so on. And, you know, apparently a lot of them are moving and they don't like it very much. So I think that's, you know, we can't operate in a vacuum. I think the level of understanding about what all of this is increasing. The level of understanding about the importance of disinformation is increasing. We've been working with platforms and doing a lot of work, my colleagues working on disinformation, to see the influence of disinformation on elections, the recent ones in Poland, going back to the European Parliament elections and so on. A lot of good cooperation from platforms because they realize their responsibility on this. I think we have to be careful about the way that populists in certain parts of the political spectrum seem to be better at using social media than others, and confusing that with disinformation, because so I don't think we are not at the moment talking about removing the responsibility for content moderation from platforms, but we are intent on making sure that they do exercise their responsibilities. Yeah.
Joanna, I see you want to add on.
I mean, I don't want to go too far from cybersecurity, but I think the DSA is the debates that we're hearing here are very relevant. The DSA was supposed to do three things. It was supposed to make sure how recommenders were working. Basically, we wanted to know targeted advertising, recommendations, and profiling of our citizens. And what we wanted to know is when big tech, we weren't telling them what to do, but if they changed something, we needed to know so we could do diff on diffs things and figure out whether it had impacts, political impacts, social impacts. And then we also asked the tech companies themselves to predict, we didn't take tax money from them, they're somebody else's company, but we said, it's your job to figure out what harms you might be causing, and then we're just going to check your work. So let us know what you think happened. So that was the things we're trying to do. And coming back quickly to what you said before, sometimes it's not about more regulation. New regulations can be better regulations. So it is about harmonizing and figuring out a simpler system.
So it's not about revolution, it's about evolution of those regulations.
No, sometimes a revolution can be an evolution, but it can be one that makes simplicity too.
Maitri, please.
I don't think, this is working. My name is Maitri Sitaraman. I'm the editor of The Chief Brief and also a founding member of the GLOBSEC Women Leaders Council. The conversations that I've heard in private rooms with cybersecurity folks is a little bit different, especially in Europe. And some of that really comes down to, say, for example, German cybersecurity top bosses saying, hey, you know what, we have been too reliant on US cyber tech for a very, very long time. At some point, if the kill switch, Joanna, is sitting in the United States and that data is being taken right back to the US, and we're handing our defense over to a suddenly uncertain ally, partner, whatever have you, we are a bit stuck at this point. So a question here is, what do we do to change that trend? Because in Europe, we love regulating, but we don't like scaling. We haven't built our own tech. So what can we do? While we love the Googles and the Palo Altos and the Mandiants of the world, what do we do to build that here? Michael or anyone?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, look, in terms of, again, it depends what we're talking about when we talk about cybersecurity and defense. In terms of the standards you need to protect your networks, I think that that's something we can share globally. I don't think there's anything proprietary about or unique to the United States with respect to the way that operates. Now, that doesn't mean you have to cede to the United States the actual implementation and operation of those systems, but certainly the architecture is something that you can borrow. And I think to the extent we have transnational platforms, those platforms can use the skills that they develop in one part of the world to defend against attacks in another part of the world. Now, that's distinct from the question of where do you house data. That's a separate set of issues, whether you keep data in your own country, whether you send it outside. And again, things along regulation about content or related to content, again, are things that may not be as easy to operate transnationally. But the basic architecture and operationalization of your cyber defenses, I think, are something that can be shared, and there's not going to be any inconsistency between what we do in Europe and what we do in the United States. Now, I wouldn't share it with Russia, but that's because I would view the Russian objective here as pulling apart our architecture and finding weaknesses. So that would be like giving your most sophisticated weapons to an adversary. But I don't think that issue arises between Europe and the US or other parts of the world where there's a kind of a basic, sometimes disagreements, but a basic fundamental alliance.
Helmut?
And to come back to what you were asking, the cybersecurity market still is a hyper-fragmented market. We are number one in the world with 8% market share. There's 3,000 vendors out there who will tell you, I have the best solution for this very tiny issue, and I can sort it out for you. You have the freedom to choose. A public organization in whichever European country can actually choose to say, hey, I want to have a kind of sovereign solution for my stuff, or I want to have on-prem versus cloud-based. Others say, I want to make sure that I have everything. I share with you that the higher the breach level has been in concrete situations, whether in Europe or whether in the United States, what we see is the more the damage has been, the more they go to full platform because you only want to go through such a drama once. Okay? And yes, and that's a question. The nice thing is an open market gives you freedom. You choose. You rather go with a startup that is very promising. Hopefully it will be there as well in 3 years. And I hope it, by the way, because that stimulates the competition also in our industry. And therefore, this path of modular platformization in times where businesses are transforming heavily are actually, we try to give this perspective. But at the end of the day, it's the customer who chooses.
Thank you. Yes, please. Or Joanna, you want to add very shortly, if you could add just 1-2 sentences.
I will, do it very shortly. One interesting solution, which is actually domiciled, I was surprised to find out in Berlin, is Wikimedia. I mean, they have found a way to provide a really good resource that is not exactly capitalistic. So I do think there's other solutions that we can come up with. And yes, indeed, there are a lot more cybersecurity. And the number of people who think that there's only one provider they can possibly use, when that particular provider, ignored their own head of cybersecurity and allowed SolarWinds to happen just because they were worried about their image, it's nuts. So I do think part of it is just about education.
You want to add on?
Just if I may add one, because I said it once already, think the unthinkable. And before think the unthinkable in terms of election, the Russian influence, for example, in the Romanian first part of the presidential election. Think the unthinkable that, we all know there's ransomware attacks, people are after your money, people are after your intellectual property. In Latin America, we had the case last year that for the first time we saw this phenomenon that actually a gas pipeline provider was taken out of business, not because somebody wanted to steal money from them or put pressure on them. They said, what you're doing is bad for the planet, and that's why we take you out of business. So think the unthinkable in terms of threat landscape that you're exposed as a business. And we as entrepreneurs, as business or policymakers, we need to take cybersecurity simply serious. It's a question of existential threat sometimes, and not only of a nice to have because we want to please a regulator that we can tick a box.
Of course. Please, yes. Do you have a mic? Can we please pass a mic? We have maximum time for 2 questions, so I ask our distinguished speaker, answer please short, straight to the point.
Anton Chekhov, Central European University, Vienna. I have a question to Mr. Ringrose, which builds partly on the previous question, but I would like to be more specific. In December 23, the European Commission launched an investigation into X, or Twitter, and nothing really happened since then. The European Commission stepped up the investigation after some of the statements of Mr. Musk in support of the alternative for Germany. The European Commission set a deadline, 15th of December. Musk had to give some materials about the algorithms because there was a suspicion that Musk could be manipulating the platform. And nothing happened since then. So what is actually happening? Of course, there are regulations, but there is not enough enforcement of that regulation. And the Commission is probably even losing credibility. The deadline was in February. Where are the investigations since then? Thank you.
I guess I would say the investigation is ongoing.
Yeah. I mean, this is geopolitics, right? I mean, as an academic, every single time we got consulted about the AI Act, we said, you know, more or less, it looks great, but you aren't putting nearly enough resources into enforcement. And it is a problem.
Okay, we have one question here, one question that, but I want to read just one from as well from Slider. Not to ignore Fox here. We discussed already U.S. administration for a long time, so not go there. Is it technically possible to ban web pages that deliver Russian disinformation and propaganda in EU?
Can I jump on that one? Because this comes a little bit back to the DSA.
Please.
That in fact, we did get Facebook to make it so people didn't make money off of disinformation, that was illegal. And a whole lot of people stopped making those web pages for Russia. You know, it isn't just that, you know, Russia itself goes and makes it. They pay people to do that. Yeah. So this is one of those things that was a success that happened in the last sort of 4 or 5 years that the Commission did block and that Facebook complied. Yeah.
Helmut, do you want to add anything?
I think it's possible. Well.
Okay. I need to ask yes or no, right? So, okay, possible.
And we have to be short.
Okay. Please, here. Yeah.
Joanna, North Macedonia, cybersecurity researcher. I would want to ask about ISACs. These are the public-private partnerships in the US model. I'm not sure if successful or not, but is there a European ISAC in defense already planned to be established specifically when we are increasing or thinking to increase 5% in the defense sector?
And we have only 1 minute to answer it, so who want to be very short?
ISACs are information sharing analyst centers.
Well, and let me just say, I think in the U.S. they've worked very well, and I think the participants enjoy it, and it allows, if in a sector or subsector of the economy, people to focus on those particular threats that are germane to that sector. So it's a very efficient method.
And there's a similar thing called Threat Intelligence Alliance. A colleague of mine is sitting here afterwards because I need to jump off, but he will be happy to.
And there's a woman, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name, but the colonel in charge of something major in NATO is floating around here saying we must invest in these more decentralized threats, not just, as she calls it, obsolete weapon systems.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I feel like we really touched the surface. There is definitely way more questions to ask, and you could use the opportunity, of course, to ask our distinguished speaker afterwards as well with all your questions. Thank you so much for this discussion. Before you move, please stay in your seats. I would like to do 2 announcements that the producer team asked me to do. First of all, for you folks, please stay in your seats because the program continues right away. And with the next session, the presentation on security challenges related to AI innovation. So that's the next session. And as well, there is new session was added that will take place at 6:05 in the same room, and it would be on recent escalation between Israel and Iran. So if you're interested in that topic, please come here 6:05. So we're not wrapping up at 6 as it's supposed to be, and it would be conducted by, I hope I pronounced correctly the name, apology if not, Amos Yadlin, former head of IDF military intelligence. So please come. And again, round of applause. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.